I'm Dave Lefkowitz. Jeff Goodman's in the studio with me, and on the phone with us is a person who knows more about the Rolling Stones intimately than Jeff or I ever will. His name is Bill German. He is the founder of the Beggar's Banquet fanzine of the Stones, and he also has written a book about them called Under Their Thumb. So I've got my thumb on the conference call of the telephone, because Bill German is with us. How are you, Bill?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, Dave.
Oh, it's great. It's terrific. And so, by the way, were you able to hear the song over the phone? Were you able to hear Sway?
I did get the monaural recording over the phone, yes.
Yeah, so you didn't hear the guitar solo at all. One of my favorite guitar solos in the world, and I love radio.
I was going to pick up my other phone extension to simulate stereo and have it both ears, but I didn't do that.
So, dude, tell the story. Tell the thing. You were a high school kid growing up where?
In Brooklyn, New York.
Yeah.
It was 1978, and I was attending South Shore High School in Brooklyn, and I was an aspiring journalist in addition to being a Rolling Stones freak. And I started a newsletter, which I called Beggar's Banquet, named after not just one of my favorite albums, but I named it because I wanted it to be, bear with me on this, I was 16 years old, I wanted it to be a banquet of Stones information that even a beggar could afford.
Aww.
So I wrote it up with a borrowed typewriter, typed it up, and then snuck into the high school's mimeograph room to run off the early copies. Which looked terrible, but at least they smelled great.
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah. Everybody remembers those machines. They printed blue. They had those rollers.
And just smelled wonderfully.
Yeah.
Oh, boy.
Remember when they were wet? They would come out sort of wet?
Yeah,
oh,
yeah. I mean, you'd love taking a test almost because it smelled so great. But anyway, so I printed it on that, and by sneaking into the mimeograph room, didn't tell any of my teachers or the principal. Nobody knew about it. It was just my little thing. Mm-hmm. And but I tried to peddle it to my fellow students, but there was one problem. Saturday Night Fever had stricken everybody in Brooklyn, and I would go up to my fellow students and say, hey, here's my Stones newsletter for 25 cents. Do you want it? And they were like, forget about it. What the heck is this? So I found no takers, and the great irony is that the people that embraced me and my little fanzine were the Rolling Stones themselves.
Now, this is the interesting part. It wasn't, just you found a couple of cool kids at the high school and they subscribed. Because I am so knowing where you're coming from, because I ran both the official newspaper and a couple of little underground newspapers in my junior high school and high school. So I know what it is to fight with the authorities there of trying to distribute your stuff in the school or on the campus, and then, having to do it in the neighborhood. But my little magazine never quite made it to the Rolling Stones. How did yours?
Well, it turns out that they were living in New York. And, if there's one bit of luck that plays into my story, it's location, location, location. Mm-hmm. So Mick and Keith and Ronnie Wood were all living in Manhattan. I was living in Brooklyn as a teenager with my folks. But I would make it my business to try to find them. And so a year into doing the newsletter, at this point I was 17 years old, and it was 2 days after my high school graduation. I found out that the Stones were having a party for their Emotional Rescue album at a club called Danceteria on 37th Street. Yeah, short-lived play. Well, it probably lasted a few years, I guess.
Yeah,
until it went up whoever's nose,
right, exactly.
No, it lasted a good 10, 15 years.
Yeah, no, but like the Steve Rebell clubs, it just, exactly. Yeah, okay.
Oh, yeah. So, anyway, I wasn't on the guest list. I wasn't going to get into this party. But I showed up with a copy of my newsletter, a handful of copies, I should say, and stood out on the street waiting for them to come out. So Mick comes out first, and he gives off a vibe like, don't come near me, So I didn't go near him. That's Mick, And then Keith and Ronnie and Bill come out, and they're exactly the opposite. They stand around and they start shaking hands with passersby and signing autographs and posing for pictures. And mind you, I wanted none of that. All I wanted was just to get my newsletter to them.
No, wait, you didn't want their autographs?
I really didn't. I was so determined and was such an aspiring journalist and wanted to come off as professional as possible that I just said, all I want... the thing is, I figured if all this works out somehow, which I didn't even, conceive of what would eventually happen, but if all this worked out, and I became a real journalist that covered the Rolling Stones, there'd be plenty of time to get autographs,
Right.
So let me make that sacrifice today and just get them the newsletter. So at one point, I see Ron Wood has nothing in his hands. The other two, Keith and Bill Wyman, were still signing autographs. But at one point, I see Ron Wood has nothing else to do. So I go right up to him, and 17-year-old kid that I am, I say, hey, here's the newsletter I do about you guys. And he took it. I put it in his hands like a process server, But he took it and he said, "Oh yeah, it's great, thanks, And I knew he was humoring me, but I didn't care. I was finally acknowledged, and one of the Rolling Stones finally had a copy of my newsletter. And I watched as he took it into the limousine with him, and for some reason the window was rolled down. And I see Keith Richards looking over his shoulders, and hey, what the hell is that, man? And Woody points at me, and it's like, hey, I got this from him, And they smiled at me. I guess they were amused to see this young kid, dedicating so much time and effort to them. And that's the memory I have of the first time I met them, as their limo drove off.
Wow.
And they only gave him one copy?
I gave him just one copy that day.
Wow.
But
he's like me. He's just like the bottom line. It's 25 cents each. I can't spare 3 of them.
Well, but the thing is that I then made it my business to keep giving them copies every time a new issue came out. So, it turns out first of all that they had an office called Rolling Stones Records, which was at Rockefeller Plaza. So I would go up to that office every time I published a new issue and just drop them off. Unexpected. I would just, security was different back then. You could just go into an office building, go up to the 12th floor where their office was.
Wow.
Their door had a big red tongue on it, and I would just go in and say, hey, here's the latest issue. So, of course, the people up there, just to get rid of me, they would humor me and say, oh, yeah, we give them to the Stones. And I didn't believe them, but I figured, let me just keep doing this. At the same time, I found out that Mick was living on Central Park West and 73rd Street, so I would go and deliver it to his doorman, and his doorman would say, oh, yeah, I give them to Mick, yeah. Well, it turns out that all these people were telling me the truth, because eventually I would start seeing the Stones around town again, because I would go to any nightclub that I thought that they would show up at. So, I knew Keith Richards loved obscure reggae bands. So anytime some obscure reggae band played, like at the Ritz or at Trax, I would go, more often than not, I was the only white person in the audience, and I would say, well, I guess Keith isn't here. But, the more I tried, eventually I would see them, and I would go up to Keith and say, hey, here's the latest issue. And he would say something like, oh, yeah, I've already got this one. I just read it on the can. And I'm like, wow, they really are getting this, and they apparently are enjoying it, and and it just snowballed from there.
I'm sorry, just the idea, of Keith Richards on the toilet, and Keith Richards on the toilet reading your work.
Exactly. But, to hear that as a 17, 18-year-old kid, you're on cloud 9. And I just had a bunch of those kinds of experiences where I would sporadically bump into them, at a nightclub. On their 81 tour, I wound up getting backstage just by getting to know different people. I got to go to Keith's birthday party backstage. And, it just kept snowballing and snowballing and snowballing until one day I get a phone call from their management. And the guy tells me that, well, Mick and Keith are insisting on making your newsletter their official newsletter. And they want to advertise it in their next album, which was the Undercover album, on a flyer. And you'll have all this new access to them. We'll let you interview them and do all this stuff. Is that okay with you?
Is that okay with you, right? Yeah.
And I was like,
let me think about it for a minute.
Yeah, let me think about that. So, of course, I said yes. And next thing I know, I'm at Mick's house interviewing him. He had a house on the Upper West Side, a 5-story townhouse on 81st Street, which, by the way, was right next door to an all-girls school, which you'd think that there would be a law against that, against Mick living next door to an all-girls school. But anyway, so I show up to his house, and he was very nice. You know, I have a chapter in the book called A Nice Bunch of Guys, and it's all about Mick, because he has multiple personalities, and it could be really nice to you one day and really not so nice to you the next day. But on this particular day, my first time at his house, he was very nice to me. The interview was going pretty well, and I decided I wanted to, you know, to round out the interview, to ask him what music he's listening to right now. What do you have on your turntable? So he jumps up from the chair and says, "Oh, let me go look, all right." And he goes into the corner and he starts flipping through his LPs.
Yeah.
Still the day of LPs. And he says, "Well, let's see, I'm listening to Herbie Hancock's latest one, and I'm listening to Bette Midler's latest one." And as he's telling me this, I say, let me check out what books he's looking at, what books he's reading. So I get up to look at the bookcase, and of course, as I do that, I accidentally kick over the glass of orange juice that I had at my feet. And now all my OJ is pouring out onto Mick Jagger's 16th century Persian rug, and Lord. I do not know what to do. I turn around to, like, say, "Hey, Mick," and he's not there. So, what? Where did he go? I'm just standing there over my puddle like an idiot. Well, a few seconds go by, and he comes back into the room. He had seen the whole thing. He has a towel in his hands, and I now have Mick Jagger, one of the most famous rock stars in the world, on his hands and knees as I stand over him, and he is blotting up my mess. And that's a vision I will never forget the rest of my life.
Nor will he, I imagine. But actually, he didn't hold it against you, and he was cool about that even.
He was very cool about it. And, you know, in fact, I said, "Oh, please don't tell your living girlfriend, Jerry Hall." And he's like, "Nah, don't worry. Besides, this is my room."
No, that's all right. And what about your encounters with Keith and with, I think you seem almost closest to Ron Wood. In a manner of...
Well, I was close to both, Keith and Ronnie Wood, but I guess I spent more time with Ron Wood. In fact, I wound up writing a book with him.
Oh, wow.
Well, he hired me when I was 23 years old. He was doing like a half art book, half autobiography. And, you know, I look back now, and, like, I wouldn't hire a 23-year-old kid to co-author my autobiography. But he did, and I wound up spending a whole bunch of time with him at his house. He was also on the Upper West Side. He was on 78th in West End.
Right. He seems like a really nice guy, I have to say.
Very down to earth. You know, he's going through some weird stuff now. You might have read in the tabloids. You know, he's been in and out of rehab. And
okay.
Yeah, and he is, like, leaving his wife of, like, 30-some-odd years to shack up with some 20-year-old waitress that he met during a bender.
He lives the dream.
Yeah, I don't know what he's thinking, though, but anyway...
we all know what he's thinking.
We know, right.
It's just he shouldn't be doing it, but we know what he's thinking.
Right. But anyway, so I would go to his house a few times a week to work on this book. I would first get there at midnight, and we would work until like 7, 8 o'clock in the morning. And the great thing is the doorbell would ring at like 3 a.m., and you never knew who it would be.
Yeah.
I mean, it was almost like a vaudeville skit. You know, the doorbell rings, and you open the door. Who is it? So, you know, it could be Mick. It could be Keith. Wow. Well, one night, this is one of my favorite ones. One night, doorbell rings, 3 o'clock in the morning. We open the door, and there standing is Stevie Ray Vaughan with his guitar strapped on. In other words, not in a case, not a guitar case, no gig bag or anything. He already has his guitar strapped on. And we said to him, like, wait a second, did you hail a taxi cab that way, standing on the street with your guitar strapped on? And, of course, the answer was yes. And the three of us went down to Ronnie's studio in the basement, where I was the sole witness of a searing jam session.
Whoa.
And so that's some of the great moments, you know, where the musical moments that I got to spend watching these guys.
We're talking with Bill German. He is the author of Under Their Thumb, and also he's the founder of Beggar's Banquet, the official Rolling Stones fanzine. Now, are you still the editor and owner of Beggar's Banquet?
No, I ran it for 17 years, and then when I was done, I put it in the ground. I felt so passionately about it. It was a labor of love. I eventually got disenchanted with it for reasons that I go into in the book. We could go into them here if you like.
Quickly, yeah, because I'm kind of curious. I mean, it wasn't just that you got bored or you wanted to move on to writing books. There was more to it?
There was more to it. I got disenchanted with how the Stones became very concerned with the bottom line, and really, all their business associates and just all the people that they deal with. And so, as any of your listeners know, to go see a Stones concert now costs you $400 or $500 face value. And so I kind of got put off by that, and just by all of their management people who were constantly trying to meddle into what I was writing. And that was the trade-off early on, actually, when I agreed. We were talking earlier, you were joking like, oh, let me think about that. I'm going to have all this increased access to the Stones. But the trade-off was... You had to write positive things. I had to write positive things, and, I would have to submit my copy before it was published. So, I learned early on some of the problems associated with that. In fact, my very first issue, as it was being printed, I get a phone call telling me that Mick doesn't like the cover photo. Now, mind you, he had seen this cover photo for like 2 months. I submitted it, and it was actually the same photo that appeared in that advertisement flyer in the Undercover album, advertising the new version of Beggar's Banquet, the official version. So 1 million people saw it in the Undercover album, and now Mick decides he doesn't like it. But I guess that's the prerogative of a rock star to change your mind last minute. And at this point, they were paying for the mimeographing? Exactly. So they could, yeah.
Did you get your own mimeograph machine?
No. This time we went to a professional place, yeah. Did they pay anything, or did they just cover all the costs? They covered the costs, and they paid me a salary. Oh. And they paid all my photographer friends. And, through the course of the 17 years of publishing the newsletter, I had, different relationships with them. Eventually I went back to a business relationship with them of I make my own money and I pay my own way, which is actually how I preferred it, to get a little bit of that freedom back. Mind you, I still had to do a dance with them, because if you piss them off, then they might not give you access, their management I'm talking about. Keith and Ron Wood, they let me print anything I wanted. They were so cool about it. But Mick was the one that was a bit of a pain and would take offense if I wrote something that he didn't like. And, he would sick his managers on me. There was one time I wanted to write about the Stones having a party down in Mexico City. They were shooting some videos down there. And so they have this party in Mexico City, and they're all there except for Mick, which is exactly how I worded it. All the Stones were there except for Mick. But I was told, no, you cannot make Mick conspicuous by his absence. And the reason for that is because Mick, while down there in Mexico City, was pursuing some extra taco, shall we say? Which would have been fine if he was a carefree single guy, but he wasn't. Jerry Hall, his living girlfriend, was back here in New York, 7 months pregnant with their first child. So I was told, don't make Mick conspicuous and reword it. So what did I do? I wrote, Keith and Ronnie and Bill and Charlie were at the party, period. Let Jerry Hall connect her own dots. The amazing things editors, not necessarily by choice, make writers do, just for the most ridiculous reasons. I'm kind of curious, when you started Beggar's Banquet, back in the day before there was the Internet, back in the day before there was cable television showing everything everywhere, how were you gathering your information as a high school kid? Where would you find out about the Stones before you even met them and had access? Well, I developed sources. First of all, I took a journalism class in high school. I was lucky enough that my high school offered one. I don't know if most high schools do, but mine did. And so I got the sense of a journalist early on, and I loved all the writers in Rolling Stone and Cream. And one of my favorite journalists, oddly enough, was Tom Snyder, quirky old dude that he was. But I loved him. And so I really viewed it as like a real piece of journalism. So I developed sources, meaning people who were twice my age. I was a teenager, but I got to meet people who were like 30 years old. Mostly I met them like in record stores and various other places. And they were going to the same nightclubs that the Stones were. So they became my sources. Oh. And some of them were hanging out, like, doing drugs with the Stones. If Woodward and Bernstein had deep throat, I guess I had deep nostrils, How rampant was the drugs and partying in that era? Oh, it was rampant. Did you actually watch it? You saw them do the drugs? You saw... Yep. I didn't see heroin or anything. I guess maybe because that was passé by the time I came around. But cocaine was very big. And so when I started to hang out at their houses, yes, the coke was flowing. And mind you, I was like the one person in the room that wasn't doing it. And there were points where their shady friends got a little suspicious of me or paranoid and like...
that you were a narc.
Exactly. Hey, Keith, what's the deal with this guy? And they would have to defend me, oh, no, Bill's just here to interview us or, whatever.
But all four Stones were partaking, is what you're saying.
Let's see. Well, I saw Mick, I talk about that in the book, one chapter. I only saw him one time that I saw it. I don't know if he did it more or not, I know that at least towards the late 80s, he wanted to stay a little healthier because of the demands of the tours and all that. So he became a bit of a health nut. So I have a feeling he stopped doing anything, like by the late 80s. But Keith and Ron Wood, would see them do it.
And Charlie?
Well, the funny thing about Charlie is everyone thought that he was all clean, and then we all discovered that he actually had a heroin addiction in the mid-'80s.
Oh.
In the 80s he had
In the 80s, right. I was just saying heroin was passé by then, but he, secretly had a heroin addiction.
You know why? Because he became a jazz drummer, and you can't play jazz if you're...
Exactly. No, that really is true. I actually make that point in the book, that I think he felt that he idolized Charlie Parker, not just drummers, but he idolized Charlie Parker and people like that, and, Ellington and Billie Holiday. And I think he figured, well, if they could shoot up, why not me?
Oh,
and he was going through a very tough time in the mid-'80s.
Wasn't he an alcoholic also, or not?
Not to my knowledge. He might have been. I guess they all had,
right,
brief bouts with it. And right now that's kind of Ron Wood's problem, mostly, is the booze. But, they've been through everything, I guess.
So now that you've published this book about doing the fanzine and knowing the Stones, is that part of your life put to bed? Are you still going to follow them, write about them, cover them at all, or are you just moving on to other horizons?
I think it is put to bed. There are cries from my old readers for me to do best of Beggar's Banquet coffee table book. So I don't know, maybe something like that. But yeah, for the most part, I think it's time to move on. This has been a great catharsis. I'll still be a fan. I'll still, if I get to go to a show, cheaply, I'll do it. I'm always interested anytime they put out a new CD. But I would like to, explore other aspects as a writer, other aspects of my life as a writer and a memoirist. And I would actually love to write about some of the other crazy characters in my life. As large as the Stones have been in my life, I have other very large characters who are not as famous, but just as unique and interesting, and maybe they will become as famous after I write about them.
Well, how can people find out how to get the Stones book and to maybe, I don't know if you have a blog, but you probably have a website.
I do have a website and a blog on that website, and it's BillGerman.com.
And it's German just like the country that killed all the Jews. It's
exactly, of which I am one, and not one that got killed, but yes, that's one of the themes in the book is how I was a nice Jewish boy from Brooklyn that got mixed up with the Rolling Stones and lived to tell about it.
And that your name was German, so there.
Yet my name was German. Go figure, irony of ironies. Yes.
BillGerman.com to get under their thumb, and also to read his blog and to find out about Bill German's life with a bunch of crazy people, including the Rolling Stones. Bill, I want to thank you. It's been absolutely just great fun and fascinating to have you in the neighborhood. I've just had a marvelous time hearing your stories.
Thanks, guys. It was my pleasure.